Welcome back to WKYT News. Governor Andy Beshear signed a proclamation that designates October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
A 2016-2017 national survey found in Kentucky more than 4 in 10 women and nearly 3 in 10 men say they have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. WKYT's Jessica Umbro talked with people who work with survivors of inter-partner violence about what this proclamation means for survivors across Kentucky.
Their voices are heard, that what they share with us on the program level, although we're not sharing, their confidential information, but their experiences, that we are listening to those and we are carrying them up the food chain.
Advocates and survivors turned advocates pack the Capitol Rotunda to mark Governor Andy Beshear's proclamation of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. One Lexington-based survivor and advocate says 12 years after starting her healing journey, she never would have imagined being in the Rotunda with Governor Beshear.
I'm a survivor myself, but that's not the end of my story. That's just part of it, and I don't have to have the shame of it anymore.
One part of the press conference involved members of the crowd participating in a Speak My Name ceremony. It exemplified the need to speak up rather than stay silent.
Erica Riley.
Each candle placed on the table symbolized a Kentuckian who lost their life to domestic violence over the past 12 months.
And it strikes me how the Bible talks about saying somebody's name, about how they're not lost if we continue to speak their name.
And by speaking their name, the hope is keeping the memories alive of those who lost their lives to domestic violence throughout October and the rest of the year. In Frankfort, Jessica Umbro, WKYT.